Namaste and welcome to the Festival of Bharat. My name is Kamal Madi Shetty and I am delighted to present before you the inaugural talk of season 4 of the Festival of Bharat. Today we are going to talk about the history of education in India. And to discuss this, we have a very special guest with us, Sahana Singh ji. Sahana ji is an author and commentator who writes on a variety of issues, including water management, environment, and Indian history. She's the author of the book, The Educational Heritage of Ancient India: How an Ecosystem of Learning Was Laid to Waste, which has been appreciated for awakening Indians to the role played by India in spreading knowledge around the world. Her second book on the same subject is awaiting publication. Sahanaji's articles have been published in a number of publications, such as the Reader's Digest, Washington Post, Discovery Channel Asia, Swarajya, to name a few. She's someone who is passionate about traveling and connecting the dots across different societies, civilizations, and disciplines. Namaste, Sahanaji, and welcome to the Festival of Bharat.
Namaste. It is an honor to be invited to speak to your audience. I look forward to this discussion.
Thank you so much. So to begin, I wanted to actually ask you that we usually hear about ancient Indian universities like Nalanda and Takshashila, but they were actually a part of a larger ecosystem of knowledge and learning that spread across ancient India. Can you tell us about this ecosystem?
Sure. So, most people seem to have heard of Nalanda and Takshashila, but actually, the whole of India was covered with educational institutions of different varieties. So, they were customized for different needs. And so, and today, even today, we have not finished excavating all those centers of learning. So, we just know some of them, but we are coming to know more and more as we are excavating more. So you're right. There was an ecosystem beyond just those centers of learning. So learning, it starts with how learning was a sacred duty of every individual. So every person was, it was his dharmic duty to educate himself and know more. So that is where the ecosystem started from there. And there were so many rituals that were performed to mark the different milestones. So when you started learning, there would be a Vidyarambha ceremony performed when a child traces alphabets for the first time. And then when the child goes into higher education, there's a ritual. So all these rituals were very important. People would be invited. And so that shows to you how important learning was in the society. And then, it was also about the love of learning. It was not forced on children. So right from a very young age, the seeds of curiosity would be planted. They would spend a lot of time in nature. Everything in nature was treated as a teacher. So it is teaching you. The sunrise is teaching you something. The river flowing is teaching you something. So that is the way it was, as if every element of nature was teaching you something. And if you read history, if you read the writings of, say, Zhuangzang, the Chinese traveler, he talks about how the love of learning is such that there are ascetics who have given up everything simply because they want to learn more and more. And they also want to teach. They keep traveling and they keep teaching whoever listens to them. They would not expect remuneration. They just teach for the love of teaching. All this has been mentioned. And then the ecosystem also can be seen in the way it was funded. Like, so it was the students and teachers were freed from the job of earning a livelihood, from the mundane job of earning a livelihood. So when I say students and teachers, I mean those who went for advanced learning, those who went for higher learning. They didn't have to worry about who is going to give them food, because the whole society will come out and give them food, will give them clothes, will give them medicines, whatever is needed. So that was the kind of ecosystem, because the students and teachers were highly respected. So, the ethos of the times demanded that the Brahmins, the students who were learning as well as the teachers, had to live a very simple life. They could not be wallowing in riches, because then they are not Brahmins. If they are rich and if they are charging a lot of money to teach, they are not Brahmins. So the ethos of the time was that the real Brahmins would lead very simple lives, and it's the duty of the society to support those people who are studying and teaching. They are the ones who are researching. So they should never be for want of food. That was the kind of thinking in the society. And even during religious ceremonies, gifts would be offered to the brahmanas. So whether upanayanas, vivahas, brahmanas would be given presents. Brahmanas meaning students and teachers. It means nothing but well-known teachers and students, who have uh, led a life of sacrifice in order that they learn, right? Because it was a very demanding lifestyle. For those who chose the path of higher education, it was very demanding. It's not that everybody wanted to go there. People would be happy with doing other things. So, to be a Brahmana and to pursue higher learning means that person is getting up very early in the morning, who's chanting, bathing, always maintaining hygiene, following all the rituals like feeding the animals before feeding oneself. All those rules used to be followed by the brahmanas. So even today at the end of a puja or a homa, the custom is to feed brahmanas. It's the same thing. You are going to feed the people who are sacrificing their lives for learning and teaching. So you are going to give homage to them. And then in the ecosystem were temples as well, because it was not just centers of learning like the Nalanda and the Takshashilas. They were also the temples which became centers of learning, because since learning itself was sacred, so when you went to pray at a temple, you would also listen to discourses. So famous scholars would come there, stay there somewhere near the temple. There would be a dharamshala to stay, and so discourses would be held, debates would be held in the annexes near the temples, attached to the temples. So people going to temples would also enlarge their vision, because they would listen to excellent debates, or get different points of view. Then I would also mention the ecosystem of vocational training, because people might think that everybody was studying the Vedas. That's not true. By and large, most people were learning some vocation or skill. That there was an ecosystem for that. So in my second book, I'm also going to be talking about that. Not everyone wanted to be a Brahmana, and so the majority of the people learned sculpting, jewelry making, carpentry, or they trained to be physicians. And so, and there were more than 64 kalas or arts. So they say that there were people who were expert in all the 64 kalas. I'm not really sure of that, but that is mentioned quite a bit. And to learn these kalas, the students would become apprentices with the master craftsmen, live with them, observe how they conduct themselves in their life. What prayers do they say? What do they eat? Alongside the actual craft, the skill, the students would observe how they lived. So this was another ecosystem of learning. And I want to point out that the much reviled Jati system actually was very conducive for learning. So children learn skills at a very young age. So imagine a child born in a carpenter's family would be watching the fathers and the uncles and the other members of the family making things with the wood, and also perhaps the ladies too. So everybody would be involved in that. And so at a very young age, the child would know everything about carpentry. Or if it was a barber's family, the child would know hair cutting. If it is a musician's family, then the child would know how to interpret different ragas, how to sing various ragas, or how to make instruments, all these things. So unlike today, when even at the age of 22 and 23, when students graduate, they still don't have any skills and they cannot earn a livelihood. They need further training. But in those days, most of the people would get into some skill, the family profession. They would know about it and they would be able to contribute to the family income when they were just 15, 16 years of age. So this is the ecosystem of India that ecosystem of learning that kept India at the top. We were the top producers and of objects, of luxury items, and also of knowledge.
Thank you so much, Sahana ji. That is very fascinating, and I'm sure it involves, it's an ecosystem that spans across exploration to skills to everything we can imagine, and it's no wonder that it is a wonderful ecosystem that thrived for so long. So this actually brings me to the second question that I have. So Indian universities and temples, they have attracted scholars from across the world, and this has resulted in a flow of knowledge to both the east and the west of India. Could you tell us about some of the scholars who actually enabled this, including both who came to India as well as some of the Indian scholars who went to various foreign lands?
Right. So this is a very vast topic, and I think it forms the longest chapter in the book that I'm almost finished, which will be out in April May. So I'll
Oh,
try to put it briefly. It's the longest chapter because so many scholars have come to India from outside, and so many have gone outside from India to other countries. It's very obvious since we had that great ecosystem that I mentioned, and we had the universities with very difficult admission tests where only the most meritorious would be selected. So there were many students flocking to India to get admission into various universities, and not just universities but also to learn the skills. Even for that, India was very famous. So the students came from China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Western Asia. I mean, you name it, and they have come from that country. I heard about Mongolia. There were students from Mongolia. So basically, east, west, north, south, wherever there was a culture of learning, there was where learning was valued. Those countries sent their best students to study in India. And the most famous names, of course, are Fahia and Zhuangzhang, but there were many scholars who came from China, especially, who left behind very detailed accounts. And many of them made very difficult journeys. So the journey is also described that they went to this extent, almost got drowned in the seas, or or starved when they were walking across deserts. So all this in order to reach India and to learn from the gurus of India. Mind you, some of the gurus of India were so famous that the students already knew them by name when they came to try and get admission in those universities. And then many of these students, when they finished their learning, would take back manuscripts with them. They would copy them as much as they could, and then they would carry those manuscripts back. The Chinese, especially, have done a lot of that. It was considered a very holy duty to bring back Sanskrit manuscripts from India. Now, there were also many Indian scholars who went from India. So, for example, China's whole ecosystem of learning was set up by the Indians to a large extent. So, we have names like Kashyapa Matanga, Dharmaratna, Sanghavarma, uh, Dharma Satya, Dharmakala, Mahabala. I mean, there are scores of names. Kashmir provided a steady stream of scholars to China. Then from southern India, also there were scholars traveling all the way from the south to China. There is one name which comes as Dharmaruchi, who spent 20 years in China, and he translated some 53 works into Chinese. And many of these scholars, when they went from India to China, they were received with great fanfare by the kings themselves. They would go and receive them with fanfare and show them that they valued what they had come for. So it was a very tedious task of translating because Sanskrit and Chinese are so different. And yet there would be whole translation bureaus which were doing this job together. And also the Buddhist monks who traveled to China, they were well trained in medicine. So in this way, medical knowledge also got transmitted to China. So, Ayurveda, that's how it went to China. Ophthalmology, Indian ophthalmology was very much in demand. It was a very popular discipline. Gynecology, pediatrics, physical fitness. So the knowledge of all this was transferred by the Indian scholars to China, who went to China. Now, in the same way, knowledge of medicine was the first to be transmitted to Greece in ancient times. So, if you read the works of John Royal, William Hunter, Johnston Saint, there are many authors who talk about how Indian knowledge of medicine was the basis of the medicine in the Western world. The Greeks and the Arabs took all that knowledge and translated it. So there is irrefutable evidence that just like medicine, the knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, grammar, logic, all this was transmitted from India via major translation movements. So the Arab translators, they mostly gave credit to their Indic sources. Mathematics itself was called Hindisa, which means that it came from Hindustan or India. And the works of early Muslim intellectuals like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Al-Farghani, Al-Tabari, Al-Khwarizmi, all these famous intellectuals during the early Islamic period when it had not become very rigid and intolerant as it became later. So these scholars, they transferred the Indic knowledge to the Islamic world. And then after that, this was from Arabic, it was translated to Latin, again via a major translation movement. So one of the major centers of translation was Toledo in Spain, where all these Arabic works were translated to Latin. Okay, the mathematical works, the scientific works. So Indian mathematician C.K. Raju has done a lot of good work. I would recommend that you should read his works to know more about it. So, for example, Fibonacci, the famous Fibonacci, he played a predominant role in changing mindsets and telling the Europeans to use the Indic way of doing arithmetic. He called it modus indorum, and the method of the Hindus that should be used to do account keeping, balancing your accounts, doing your addition, subtraction, because that's a better way, and that has been mentioned by Fibonacci, right? So there has been a constant movement of knowledge via translation movements. So if you start looking at the translation movements, you'll see that. So there was no, if you look at the Renaissance, European Renaissance, suddenly a whole lot of books came out and it seemed like the golden period, but that was actually because of the translation that was done, the translation of the Arabic works to Latin, and all these books were suddenly made available. And so it became a renaissance for them. But if you see the core of that knowledge, it's all Indian. So and the same thing happened when the colonizers started coming to India, then there was another wave of knowledge transfer. So whether you take the Portuguese or the French or the Dutch, they all collected a large number of manuscripts because they were very interested to know what is in those manuscripts. And then they would translate them and they would write papers on them, which would be published in journals in Europe. That's the way it worked. And the British collected the largest number of Indic works, and even today you'll find them scattered across their museums and various storing centers. So I have synthesized a lot of this knowledge in my book to show how India was the source of so much knowledge. I would invite everybody to read the book, and we should get our history right.
Absolutely, Sahana ji. That is absolutely fascinating, and there is so much that probably most of us are not aware about. But thank you for those very rich insights. I wonder that a, a higher education system of such depth and such influence would only be possible if there was a strong foundation at the grassroots level in terms of what we call today primary and secondary education. Could you tell us about how this was done? How was education like for children?
Right. So, see, we can only make inferences because there is no one book which will tell you everything about how education was like, right? Even I have had to piece together a lot of evidence. But it is very clear that there was an excellent system of village pathshalas in which elementary education was imparted, and children learned how to read and write, to do basic arithmetic, grammar. They learned the stories in the epics, they learned about the stories in the Panchatantra. So all this we can see from the various stories itself, that how when they describe what's happening in those stories, we can make out that there was a vibrant system of pathshalas. So I mentioned the Vidyarambha ceremony where a child is initiated into alphabets, and both girls and boys had this ceremony. And then we also get a lot of evidence from the surveys that were commissioned by the British in the 19th century. Before the British imposed their educational policy, they conducted many surveys within India. So you can call it as the just the pre-colonial period or the pre-British period, and you will know what the basic elementary education system was like. So from that, you actually come to know what that there was actually, even though it was decaying, the primary education system had decayed under the Islamic rule. But even then, whatever was left of it was quite good, and you can see this in the surveys which have been conducted by the British themselves. So the results of the survey was lying in the British archives in London, and they were highlighted to the Indians by Dharampal. That's the reason Dharampal's book, The Beautiful Tree, is very important. Everybody should read this book because it talks about those surveys conducted on indigenous education of India by the British. So when Dharampal found out all that, he copied everything. He tried to, I don't, photocopy was not there. He copied everything, brought it back to India and published it as a book. So from those surveys, you can see that from different parts of India came reports of the excellent teachers, dedicated teachers, superior methods of teaching, and high attendance in schools. So you come to know that this was the kind of Pathshala system that existed. And Dharampal also discovered Thomas Munro's statement that every village had a pathshala. And then Adams had given a report, William, I think William Adams was his name, who said that there were 100,000 pathshalas in Bengal alone. Okay. And also, the British noticed that the Shudras were in majority in many of the schools, while the Brahmanas were in lesser numbers. In Tamil Nadu, in Kerala also. So all those numbers are given in the surveys. There are tables which tell you that, for example, in Tamil-speaking areas, the Shudras ranged from 70% in Salem and Tinnevelly to 80%, 84% in South Arcot. So these are startling numbers where you are thinking that Shudras are not allowed to go to school, but then you're finding that Shudras are also in this going to schools and they are with the Brahmanas. And then in Malayalam speaking Malabar, Brahmin students constituted only 20% of school, of 20% of the student population, while the Shudras were 54%. Muslims were 27%. You find that in Bellary in Karnataka also. So this shows that India had a widespread system of general education, general schooling before the British came, and they studied us, and then they decided to change it all by imposing their own education system because they wanted to produce clerks. They wanted people who would be useful to them. So that's how they changed everything. And it was also noticed that the schooling system in India was better than the one in England because in England there was no elementary system until very late. It was quite late that when they were still debating on India's education policy, at that time England was still languishing in illiteracy. Most people only knew how to just maybe read and write, and they knew a bit of the Bible. That's the only book they came across. So this is very interesting. Despite the degradation that came from the Islamic rule, we still had a functioning school system at the grassroots level. Okay. And there were also many low cost innovations that were noticed by the British. For example, there is one Reverend Andrew Bell. He was touring through the Madras presidency, which consisted of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and a number of other states, today's states, quite a big, almost the whole of South India. And he noticed that the literacy was very high, and he was surprised. So he wanted to know how it's happening. And then he noticed that outside the schools in Madras presidency, there were heaps of sand that had been placed outside the schools, and the children were learning how to trace the alphabets on them. The older children were helping the younger children to learn the alphabets, to do simple arithmetic. And he noticed that even when the teacher is not around, the students are still learning. They're not making noise and playing, but the older children are teaching the younger children using the sand heap. So they didn't even need a blackboard. So he was astonished. He said, "Oh, we thought that in England we need blackboards, we need infrastructure, and that is why, because of that, we do not have high education, we do not have literacy. So, but actually, you don't need blackboards. You can do it this way." So this is how it was called the Madras method. And you'll be surprised to know that Andrew Bell introduced this in England, right? And this was introduced even in Europe, West Indies, in Bogota, in Colombia. So that is how this system became very popular, especially the mentorship program, because they realized that they have very few teachers and there are so many students. So why not use the older children to teach the younger kids? So that was a revolutionary innovation for them. And so you can also go back in time and imagine what the pathshalas were like in ancient India. It must have been similar to this. Then, if you have time, I'd like to tell you about Reverend Robertson, who was another Christian missionary who wrote about his observations in Bengal. And he noticed a very unusual method of examination. So he said that once a month, all the schools, all the schools would send their students to one place. They would all meet in one place, and then the top student of one school would put a question to the top student of another school. And then if he could not answer, then it would go to the second student. If he could not answer, it would go to the third student. And then the same thing would happen from the other schools. You know, the other student, the top student of another school would put a question to this school student. So there would be this cross questioning. And this is the way, this was an examination actually. And the students would have fun. They wouldn't even feel like they're being examined. So Robertson pointed out that there is such a spirit of fun when an examination is happening, this whole thing, and Brahmins and Shudras are sitting next to each other and doing this. And sometimes the Shudra student is getting more marks in these examinations than the Brahmana student, and he doesn't mind. So imagine this kind of innovative examination, which was there even when the British have just come to India. So go back in time and imagine how much more innovation might have been there when there was no oppressive rule, right? So you see, even at the grassroots level, before the British imposed their crippling policies and their taxation, which is what ultimately starved off the education system, so we had a very well functioning schooling system at the grassroots level.
Absolutely, Sahana ji. I mean, it's from innovative quizzes to outdoor learning to the best, I mean, the most innovative pedagogical methods that one could think of. Thank you for sharing that. I wonder what was the role of women like in education, girls and women, be it in different stages of women. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So, in ancient India, education was as important for women as it was for men. There was no difference. So, they would also have the Vidyarambha, they would have the Upanayana, they would wear the sacred thread. Then, what can be more telling than the fact that the goddess of learning is Saraswati, who is female. So, she is the Devi. We meditate on her when we want learning, we want speech, we want eloquence, knowledge of music. That itself shows you that women were very much part of the education system. And if you look at the famous debate between Shankaracharya and Mandana Mishra, the judge was a lady, a woman of high learning. So this shows. And then we have as many as 30 women who are mentioned in the Rig Veda. They composed important suktas of the Rig Veda. And these ladies must have made real contribution to the advance of scholarship. Otherwise, why would their names have to be chanted every day, right? Now, the problem is, since we are disconnected from the past, we don't know what are all the books that they wrote or what they composed, but we are told to remember them every day. So this shows that women were so important in education. And the other evidence we have is yajna, because in ancient times, yajnas were extremely important rituals, right, which were performed, which needed a lot of knowledge. You needed a knowledge of geometry. You have to prepare the altar, you have to make the yantras, you have to have good pronunciation, you need to know grammar. So yajnas are a good example. If somebody is doing a yajna, you know how educated they are. And you see in the ancient books, we see the learned women performing yajnas, right? In Ramayana itself, you have Kaushalya, who is performing a yajna all by herself. It is mentioned on the eve of Rama's coronation as the Yuvaraja, she was performing a yajna all by herself. So this gives you the proof. And then women were, and there was a term called Brahmavadini. Brahmavadinis were women who wanted to devote their lives to learning, and they would often not marry. And of course, if they decided to marry, then that would terminate and they would lead a married life. But there were women who did chose not to marry but pursue higher learning their whole life. They traveled all over India. They also taught, right? And women were studying complex and abstract subjects like the Purva Mimamsa, which is not at all easy, right? And there are terms for women who are learning various subjects, women specialists in the subject, which are mentioned in the Mahabhashya. So if there were enough women studying that subject that you need to coin a word for that, then you know how many women were studying, right? And there was a whole tradition of women as teachers. So we have terms like upadhyaya, which signifies a female teacher, and she is different from upadhyayani, who is the wife of a male teacher. So, and then you have Bhaskaracharya, who wrote Leelavati, a book on mathematics, which is throughout addressed to a girl, to a young, beautiful girl. He keeps addressing her as he's explaining all the various, asking her to solve the questions, and he's telling her how to solve the questions, the arithmetic questions. So, and also if you see in the Yajur Veda, you can see, and Atharva Veda, all the Vedas, it was desirable that a woman of learning did not marry beneath her. She did not marry someone with lesser learning than her. I think they probably knew that it will be a very hard marriage if the woman is more educated, right? So in the Yajur Veda, it is. I mean, what I meant is, if a woman is more educated than her husband, it is going to be hard. That part was very clear. So in the Yajur Veda, it is mentioned that a daughter who has completed brahmacharya should wed one who is learned like her. And there is a shloka in the Atharva Veda which says that a woman has very little chance to find a good husband if she is not well educated as a brahmacharini. Okay, I think this is a very an amazing testimony to the knowledge centric society of India. The fact that women need to be educated in order to find good husbands. Then there are expressions, about in the marriage ceremony itself, where the girl is said to be one who is a good speaker in assemblies, who speaks in assemblies where debates are held. So she's also one who speaks well, debates well. So, but again, we must remember that not all women went for higher education. That was not that all women would have wanted. You see that even today. So, a basic education was available to everybody, whether they were girls, boys, and most of them got skills because that is the way they earned a livelihood. So, only a few women would probably have gone for that higher education, very high education, where they would not be willing to marry, right? and and we can see that this kind of an advanced society, what kind of a setback it must have suffered when the foreign invasion started taking place, right? When Ghaznavi, Ghori, and this whole period of Islamic rule, when that happened, women's freedom had to be severely curtailed, and it was absolutely dangerous for them to go out. They could be kidnapped. The whole society was in turmoil, and there were slave markets where the kidnapped women could be sold and they would be traded. Right, the slave markets opened up in Delhi. There was a well-known slave market. So under these conditions, you can't expect women's freedoms to survive and women going out to schools and universities to study. So we should not looking. We can't even imagine what it was like at that time and how it would have affected the society, right? So in the end, it would seem to me that a woman's desires and resolve, they would determine how far she would go in life, whether it was in ancient India or later, even after the invasions and everything, or even today. It's up to the woman's resolve. If she wants to study something at any cost, she will go and do it. But there will be people telling her, "Come on, get married. You should have children," because that's also a dharmic duty. Because it is understood that if a majority of women choose to only study, work, and not have families, or have only have maybe one child, then it's not it lead to a severe decline in the population. So the pragmatic aspect also was understood, I think, by most women. So that's the reason that not everybody went into higher education, which would involve cutting themselves off from society. So that's what it was. Women's education was available for those who wanted. They could go ahead and pursue it. There were challenges, just like today.
Absolutely, and I think the important thing was there was so many. It was a myriad of opportunities and different paths that individuals, be it men or women, could undertake. You've spoken about how innovative some of the methods, teaching methods, and learning methods have been. And there was a lot of original thinking that was encouraged, and a rich tradition of debate was very commonplace in educational institutions of ancient India, be it the pathshalas or the universities. Could you tell us about something about these traditions?
Sure. So, logic and debate, was extremely significant. They were significant for India's philosophical tradition. That's why we have so many darshanas, we have so many schools of philosophy. That's all because of the whole culture of logic and debate that we have. And we find references to Tarka Vidya, which is the science and art of logic and debate, Vada Vidya, the art of discussion. We find the mention of these Vidyas in innumerable ancient texts, like in Ramayana, Mahabharata, Manusmriti, Skanda Purana, Yajnavalkya Samhita, Chandogya Upanishad, just naming a few. So Tarka Vidya and Vada Vidya were very important. And there were many, many books written on logic and reasoning. Today, they are not available. We just find them as references, excerpts, some other scholar referring to them, because so many of our books have been destroyed. But the culture was to ask questions. There are many, in fact, many treatises which are written in the form of questions and answers. There is, Parvati asking questions to Shiva, Shiva is answering. So question answer was the way, and debate, of course, was the way. And then the terminology of debate was so well developed that you'll be astonished if you read those, whatever books are available on logic and debate. So in my book, I have mentioned many terms like sadhya, Sadhya meant the thesis which is to be established. Then there is Siddhanta, which is the proposition, tenet, or conclusion. Then there is Hetu, reason. There is positive example, negative example. There is Anumana, which is inference. There is Pramana, which is proofs. So they would say, "What is your Pramana?" Okay, this is not a good Pramana. All those kind of things would happen in a debate. The debate was a subject in itself. There were protocols to be followed, and it could also be a form of examination. So when the teachers, the evaluators would see how children are students are doing in a debate, and then deem them fit to get a certificate to that they have passed in this subject of debate. And Zhuangzhang, the Chinese traveler, has mentioned that in Nalanda they frequently assembled to have debates. There, those who were able to put forward the finer points in philosophy, those who could explain the subtler principles, or those who were ornate in diction, they would be rewarded. And the kings also played a role in nourishing the spirit of debate, because the kings would ask for debates to be held, because that is a way for the kings themselves to learn about different points of view. And then big prizes would be given out, and the winners of the debates used to be taken in a chariot and taken all over the city. In fact, in cities like Ujjain and Patliputra, the scholars who won the debates went in such grand processions in cars. It was called the Brahmaratha, in which they would be taken around the city. And the scholars like Panini, Pingala, Patanjali, they were all supposed to have been honored like that, according to Rajasekhara, a poet who describes these processions. So this was the spirit of debate, and even though there was monarchy, there was also this spirit of debate and the culture of free speech.
Right, absolutely, and I think the richness in in the debate, the traditions of debate, obviously led to the kind of richness in thought and the thoughts that and ideas that came out of that system. When we look at some of the magnificence of, be it in ancient India, the universities and temples of learning, or the schools and the pathshalas, one wonders, I mean, over centuries, how this rich educational system, that the entire ecosystem in India faced a lot of unfortunate and very painful destruction. First, it was the Islamic invasions that saw large scale destruction of universities and temples of learning, and then under the British rule. So, what was the kind of damage that especially these two big disruptions, caused to our knowledge systems?
It has been a huge damage. I mean, it is even disturbing to talk about the damage, the incidents which happened, right? So the biggest damage has been to our psyche. Today, we cannot even imagine that an entire university is destroyed with all its students, teachers, entire libraries burning for months. But this is what happened with us, right? If we think of Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, if anything like that happened with even one of them, just imagine the mind recoils from that happening. But that is what happened to us, to all our famous universities in India from the 12th century onwards, right? Nalanda, Vikramshila, Odantapuri, these were destroyed by Muhammad Bakhtiar Khilji. Then subsequent years, as the Islamic rule spread and consolidated, then more universities were destroyed. Jagaddala, Somapura, Vallabhi in Gujarat, Kashmir, brutal destruction. And can you imagine what scholars would have felt like at that time, when they know anytime somebody can come and set fire to their university, burn their books. So in fact, it is said that even before Kutubuddin Aibak could send his people to go and destroy temples, many Brahmin scholars fled from there. That is what is said. Of course, everybody could not flee, and a large number of scholars died because temples were centers of learning. So Qutbuddin Aibak asked for those temples to be destroyed, and whoever could flee with the manuscripts, they fled. And there were many migrations within India as a result of this persecution on the basis of religion. Some of the scholars from Vikramshila, they made their way to Tibet, and because of that, when it went to the scholars who carried their manuscripts, who managed to escape with the manuscripts, and they were translated to Tibetan, and that's how we know what Nalanda was like, because we have those translated works. So this is the kind of damage. And Al-Baruni, the 11th century chronicler, who recorded how Mahmud Ghazni invaded India. And he's written about how Hindus were scattered like atoms of dust in all directions, and how the Hindu sciences receded to areas where our hands cannot reach them, like Kashmir, Varanasi, and South India. He mentioned that. Of course, in the succeeding centuries, even Kashmir, Varanasi, and South India were reached by those same elements which who destroyed universities. So only where the Hindu Rajas were able to retain their territory, there we were able to keep our education system intact to some extent and the manuscripts. There was also some respite during Akbar's rule because he opened up the madrasas for Hindus to come and study. But again, it was brief. Aurangzeb came and reversed everything. You will hear stories of Brahmanas and Jains trying to carry manuscripts to safe places, sometimes burying them somewhere, later taking them out. All these stories you will read when you study the real history of India. And so the Muslim education was patronized by rulers who formed the Mamluk dynasty, the Tughlaq and the Lodi dynasty, also the Mughals and the Bahmani sultans. So Delhi became one of the foremost centers of Islamic learning. And many Hindus converted to Islam because that way they could avoid paying the jizya tax. And they also learned Persian as a way of gaining respectable positions in the court. So again, this is the way we got damaged. And this is also the time when caste stratification became more rigid. Earlier, there was a lot of mobility, but now, because of all these outside forces coming in and creating mayhem, so people became a little more inward looking. They wanted to marry within the community so that they preserve their traditions. Women's freedoms were restricted. I mentioned they could not move freely. Their education was curtailed, and they had to cover their heads, and all that started. Another big damage was the neglect of science during the Mughal rule. So, when the Mughals were ruling, India was one of the richest countries in the world. And that's the time when Indian knowledge has already gone to Europe and they are building upon it and they are coming up with the latest technologies. And that's the time when the Mughals, they were not interested in science. They were interested in poetry, literature, and all that, but they didn't care for science. They could have built up on the leading edge concepts of the Hindu scholars of an earlier era like Aryabhatta, Brahmagupta, Bhaskaracharya. But such thoughts were not even in the minds of those rulers. So we had a situation where madrasas were proliferating and students were becoming adept in the Quran and the Hadith. But the Western world was making great advances in science and technology. And the Mughal kings missed the opportunity to ride on the wave of technological discoveries, even though they were ruling over the richest land. That's how, when the British came to rule over India, they didn't see any evidence of science education. They didn't know that there was, once upon a time, such an importance given to science education. So they went about imposing their own policy, the British, with their own selfish reasons, and they destroyed the indigenous element to education system. They introduced English medium instruction. The damage done to our psyche was such that we started looking down on ourselves, right? The colonial and the Christian missionary forces ensured that India got disconnected from her roots. They were constantly told, "Oh, you are the people of Sati. You are the people, where you don't know anything. You're superstitious. Whereas we'll give you science." That kind of a thing. And we know about Macaulay's Minute, right, which talked about creating a class of persons who are Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, in intellect. So this has been the biggest damage to India. We have all been taught to view our culture with an alien gaze. There are many Indians who have self-loathing and think that Indians were backward and regressive until British gave them modernity, they gave them science, right? They gave them logical thinking. This is the kind of brainwashing that has happened. We have lost our languages. We cannot read our own texts. We don't know Sanskrit, so we need the translations written by the colonizers. So this is the damage, a huge a degree of colonization and disconnection from our roots.
It is indeed a very painful history, and I can imagine the destruction of education would only lead to the sort of a downfall in many other aspects of our civilization. And it explains so many things which I think continue even till today. Um, and it makes me wonder, we may not be able to fully recover our lost knowledge systems, especially in days where there was no internet. The manuscripts were everything, and those were destroyed, and many which we cannot recover. But we can certainly build upon what we, as people, as a civilization, we have managed to preserve through millennia, in fact. And in current times, we see a very contrasting picture. We have so I mean, and in many ways, our education system is in a very bad shape in many aspects. And as a society, we have also deeply internalized some of the colonial and Marxist ideas, and we are only beginning to reconnect back to our civilizational roots. Do you think that our educational heritage can actually guide us as we try to fix the way in which we impart education in India today?
Yes, absolutely. That is the whole reason why I've written one more book on the same topic of educational heritage. It is not just to say that, oh, we were the greatest, but we can use that to find our way to the right kind of education to motivate ourselves. So until now, the education system, which is a remnant of the colonial system, has made very little effort to infuse civilizational pride in the Indian students. So national pride is important. Indians are need to be proud of their nation, but we should also remember that ours is the only continuous living pluralistic civilization. Unlike the other ancient civilizations like the Greek, the Persian, or the Sumerian, or the Mesopotamian, they were all annihilated by the monotheistic creeds. And ours is the only ancient civilization which is still intact in the sense that we are still practicing our religion, we still have our festivals and traditions. So we must be proud of what our ancestors achieved in every discipline, and I think we should adopt the best ideas and put them into our current education system. So this our heritage will help us to find our way back. Now, the new NEP, the National Education Policy, has introduced some good things. Like it has mentioned the need to have rootedness and pride in India. It also talks about the rich, diverse knowledge systems of India and traditions and all that. But I don't know how well it will be implemented. How is this civilizational rootedness going to be brought into every student? We need a completely fresh, multidisciplinary approach to history. All of the old assumptions about chronology, the European translations of our text, they need to be revised, they need to be revisited. We need new textbooks on history, social studies, literature, and our textbooks must present a holistic picture of the Indic civilization, which encompass the knowledge system, traditions, and culture. We need to see how the common people understand their own culture. We need those frameworks. I'm not saying exclude the outsiders framework completely. It is useful at some stage. We should know about it, but that's not the only thing which should be taught. If the only way history is taught is from the colonizer's gaze or the Marxist gaze, then you're excluding the core of knowledge and you are projecting the fringe as the core. So I would say we must introduce courses on the great books of India. Students should know what are the great books of India, like the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, the principal Upanishad, Yoga Vasishta, Natya Shastra, the selected Sanskrit plays. They should know what are the great books of India, and they should know what is in them. So today, if you ask a student to give a summary of, do you know what is in Natya Shastra, they won't know, right? Most young Indians would struggle to reply if they are asked to summarize the significance of the Shastras or literary works. So we need courses to be taught on the history of Indian sciences also, apart from Shastras, the literary Shastras. We need the history of Indian sciences, including medicine, music, arts, architecture, town planning, water management, navigation, textiles. We need histories of all these also to be included. And then we should not just know the names of Aryabhatta and Sushruta. We should know what did they do, what did they write, what did they say. Put it in simple form if you like, but the students should be taught that. Unless the students themselves see that the scientific and the systematic underpinnings of the Sankhya and the Nyaya Vaisheshika philosophies, unless they see what's in the Ayurvedic texts and the logical rules laid out by Panini, the grammar, unless they see all that, decolonization will not happen. and Indians will continue on the path which has been laid out by Macaulay. So we need hundreds of textbooks to be written in the coming years, and I want to contribute to that effort. For decolonization to happen, we need textbooks which completely change the framework, which give you your own eyes back. We take out the Westerners, outsiders gaze and get our own eyes. So that's what we need.
It is indeed. I mean, the vastness and the richness, I think, of the ideas spanning across various fields, be it art and culture or science and technology, and the traditions of debate. I think there is so much that Bharat as a civilization should inform India as a nation today. And only then can we sort of seek and fulfill our full potential. Thank you so much, Sahana ji, for a very brilliant and very inspiring ideas that you have shared with us and the insights that you have shared with us. And I'm sure our viewers have a lot to think about. There is so much we have to go back and read and understand about our civilization. But you have given us the inspiration to do that. I'm very grateful to you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm glad to be part of this, and we are all in the same journey together.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.